it's shouldn't come as a surprise or news to anybody that freight cars really only have value to the railroads when they can haul loads and make money. And if a car is by regulation basically removed from active service,
Mhm.
uh, as is the case uh, with certain tank cars, were found to be wanting in the event of a crash. Back, off they go, even if they're still roadworthy. Um, Other cars are retired because the customers no longer want the small capacity, or they're otherwise obsolete. But if you pose the riddle, what car earns its keep but never holds a load? That would be an idler car. So we're going to look at three kinds of idler cars, or three uses for idler cars. Uh, are you seeing me progress? Are you now looking at a car ferry picture?
Yeah,
Yes.
the Grand
Okay,
Trunk Factory. Yeah.
good. So for rail fans and modelers in Milwaukee and other Great Lakes cities, probably the idler cars that you paid the most attention to were on the Great Lakes car ferry service. This is the Grand Trunks terminal in Milwaukee, where they had a neat little box cab. And the reason for the idler cars would be to keep the weight of the locomotive off the car ferry itself. It's a somewhat delicate balance job to load and unload a car ferry. And while you could ship a locomotive on a car ferry, you don't want it going on and off as it reaches deeper into the ferry to remove the shipment of cars. So this is basically a cropped version of the same photo showing the just two basic idler cars that would enable that locomotive to reach deep into, well, in this particular case, it's the Grand Rapids ferry. Here's a similar situation a little further away in the Milwaukee Harbor. This is the C&O car ferry. In this case, it's the Badger, and they were switching with, I think, three idler flats. Once again, cropping the photo. Uh, and again, the purpose is to keep the weight of the locomotive off the boat. Um, Here's another shot in Milwaukee of the other C&O car ferry, the Spartan. And again, you can see uh, the idler cars reaching into the boat to remove the cars from the newly arrived car ferry. Um, Now we're going to shift attention to Vancouver, British Columbia,
Mhm.
where the Canadian Pacific has a couple of different kinds of car ferries. Here's kind of a classic looking car ferry, not unlike what you see, I think, in parts of the New York Harbor. But they also had a rather sleek looking modern car ferry that was in service on the day I was in Vancouver. So this would have been in 1993. And they would turn it around after its arrival and get it ready for departure. And in the yard paralleling that area is where the CP kept its idler flats. Um, as you can see, they are skeleton flats. The decks have been removed. They are antiquated cars, as you can tell from the trucks. Um, and they had a considerable number of these idler flats, more than I would have thought necessary.
Mhm.
Here we see them preparing to unload a newly arrived ferry. And as you can see, one of the idler flats, or the one that they chose to put first, had a handy railing for the brakeman to hold on to it. And it reminded me of like a transfer caboose railing. Anyway, the switcher is pushing a line of idler cars in towards the ferry. And again, as you can see, these are skeleton um, flats with no deck. There's no temptation to use these for anything other than idler flats. And the locomotive is pushing them onto the ferry so it can unload the boat. So that's one kind of idler flat. And probably as car ferries have become of diminished significance, they're becoming more and more rare. But here's a different use for idler flats. This is a very heavy load. This was uh, 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 due to be placed into a new electric plant down in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, which is south of where Ken lives. And as you can see, they had idler flats on either side of that heavy duty flat car.
Hmm.
One thing they would do is add braking power, but the other would be to keep the weight of the locomotive and that specially heavy load off bridges at the same time. So they acted as spacer cars. Um, and uh, I think this was, I guess this would be a turbine, a steam turbine.
Hmm.
Now, uh, again, one reason for these flats would be for braking power, but when I say keep the weight off the bridges, a few moments before I took these particular pictures in South Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that train would have passed over the 1883 Stone Arch Bridge, is
Yeah.
over both a creek and a road. And it's, again, it's an 1883 bridge. And I think it's safe to say it's not in tip top condition. So you wouldn't want to take too many chances with it.
Hmm.
Um, Moments after I took those pictures of that special shipment, um, the train would have passed over the Marquette Avenue Bridge in in South Milwaukee, and it too, on its bridge abutment, it had some issues that would maybe warrant a little caution about putting an especially heavy load and an especially heavy load coupled right next to a locomotive over it. And then a few minutes south in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, is American Avenue, and that train would have passed over this bridge, which uh,
Wow.
also had a few issues, including you can see the rebar and a very nice sequence of cracks on the bottom concrete surface.
Yeah.
So probably the Union Pacific was showing a wise precaution in using those idler cars between the locomotive and that very heavy load. That was a double truck flat car that the load was on, by the way. I didn't really focus on that when I took the pictures. Um, Here we are in Galesburg, was Illinois in 2008, and this would be an example of another heavy load where if you knew you had some iffy bridges, you might have idler cars. But interestingly, this particular picture, most of the bridges on the BNSF are kept up much better than those three bridges I showed you on the Union Pacific in South Milwaukee and Oak Creek. But if you look at this particular load, you'll see another reason for idler cars, although this is not an idler car, but it's a load that extends over the end of the car. So that load to the right is extending over and probably accounts for why that rather uh, 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 house-shaped load is not mounted in the center of the car, which would be the wiser way to load to avoid uh, excessive wear. But it's been pushed off to one side to make room for that uh, dimensional load that's exceeding the length of its own flat car. So that's the kind of of idler cars we're going to be looking at now. The kind of idler cars that are meant to accommodate an excessively long load. Here we are back in South Milwaukee at the Pasira Series Company, and this boom, dragline boom, is being shipped, and it just extends beyond its gondola, and so it has an idler car, really just for about 4 feet, maybe 5 feet of excessive length load, but you got to do it. Here's another boom, which seems to extend off the ends of both ends of this particular gondola. So there's an idler car towards the lower left of the picture, and when it's finally shipped, there'll probably be another idler car on the other end. Here's a more modern excessive length load at the same Bucyrus Erie plant in South Milwaukee. It's now the Caterpillar. Actually, what you're looking at here isn't even Caterpillar anymore. It's Caterpillar sold it, and it's being used for a variety of smaller businesses. But it's another example of a load so long that extends beyond both ends of the flat car it's mounted to. Note that there are what look like timbers on the flat car so that the load is elevated. The load isn't resting on the idler car, it's resting above the idler car. Another shot of the same load. Now, technically, then, what you're looking at here is used like an idler car, but again, they decided to use the unneeded portion of the flat car for an actual revenue load. So that technically, what we're looking at is not an idler car, but it's acting like an idler car because of the excessive length of the load to the far left. This steel shipment was just a little bit longer than its flat car. So there are idler cars on either end. And as you can see, this is I can't remember what year I took this picture, but it's probably about 1982. And the Pennsylvania Railroad had obviously ceased to care very much about the decking on this particular, well, it would have been the Penn Central or Conrail by this time, but the decking on this car ceased to be important once its primary purpose in life became being an idler car, as is its use right here. And in fact, we used to see a fair number of these antiquated Pennsylvania Railroad flat cars at Butler Yard in Milwaukee because they were still roadworthy and could serve as idler cars. And when you've got the kind of factories that the Milwaukee area had back at that time, you needed idler cars because they were shipping big stuff. Some of those shipments of a single drag line from the Bucyrus Erie plant in South Milwaukee might call for 300 freight cars.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a different Pennsylvania Railroad flat car, for example, with somewhat better looking decking. But once again, its use was probably that, an idler car. And still another Pennsylvania Railroad flat car that you'd see now and then at Butler Yard in the Milwaukee area on the Chicago Northwestern. And again, most likely serving as as needed as an idler car. We've returned to the Bucyrus Erie plant in South Milwaukee. And at first glance, this may simply look like a railroad wreck crane and its boom car. But in fact, this is a shipment. The crane is being shipped to the Union Pacific. And the flat car it's coupled to is a Santa Fe flat car. And it looks like they might have some crates or something mounted on the far end of the flat car. But for all practical purposes, this is a idler car, but for purposes of shipping this 250-ton Bucyrus Erie railroad crane. And here we are back in Galesburg on the BN or BNSF, let's see, 2013, and a load of what appear to be utility poles of extreme length. And again, it exceeds the length of the car on both ends. So there are two idler cars, one on each end.
Hmm.
Usually they write the length of a pole on the end in chalk. And I'm trying to see what I can see here. I can't make these out, but there's other pictures where you can see the length. Here's poles in transit at Galesburg in 2004. And once again, idler cars on both ends because of the extreme length of these, what I assume to be utility poles. So that's just a cropped version of the same picture. Now, this is also on the BNSF, but this is a freight train heading towards, well, it was heading towards Beardstown, Illinois. Where it was going beyond that, it wouldn't, Beardstown is not a destination for much of anything. So where it was going beyond that, I'm not sure. But they had many excessive length utility poles on this particular train, although they weren't all coupled together. And I think all of them involved idler cars. Now we can see, I see one pole marked 100,
90,
90.
75,
Yeah.
110.
Wow.
Woo.
Uh, yeah, that's an extraordinary length. And as you can see, this particular flat car has been modified with those posts to hold the pole load in place, in addition to the strapping that holds the load in place. So this is probably a dedicated service flat car. Uh, let's see, a different flat car with different 115 feet
Hmm.
I'm seeing,
Right.
and some 90 footers.
Hmm.
And again, they extend beyond both ends of the car.
Oh, man.
Yet another example. Let's see. I
Mhm.
see 100 feet. Uh, anyway, very long, very long poles. And here's the I once again and notice that the loads, there's timbers underneath the loads, or maybe actually steel beams, so that the loads don't rest on the idler car. They hang above the idler car.
And they have to on curves.
Oh yeah, you wouldn't want that would be a potential derailment issue. And you also have to be mindful of just how far the load extends off the flat car over the idler car, because you could create something that's a potential excessive width load on curves that would cause other trains to have to be held or sent into passing siding.
Yep.
So someone has to think of all these things. That's just a close up of the idler car itself. Well, 115 feet for some of those logs.
Wow.
For not logs, poles, utility poles. And
Yeah,
that's
looks
a pretty and that's a pretty darn long flat car too. That I would assume, 89 feet.
yep.
And as again, you can see it's been specially modified with those uh, steel posts to hold the load in place. And you can
Yeah.
see the size of the timbers holding the load are considerable as well. That might be like 10 inches by 10 inches.
Yep. It's like an auto rack type flat car with
Yeah.
the cutout around the trucks there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Or at least some of them are probably tri-levels.
Think how tall the trees were.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
No, I
And
wonder.
and and
Think how tall
and,
the trees were that they cut.
and then consider that the the if you want to call it the skinny end of the utility pole is still plenty big, and there would have been plenty of tree above that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Wow.
These poles are again uh, two shipments are sharing the same idler car. Uh, uh, I think I see 91 on the poles to the left. So those are 91-foot poles. They all seem to be the exact same length on that particular shipment.
Hmm.
And it also looks to me like it's darn close to touching the deck of its idler car.
Yeah.
Yep.
It appears that they used uh, short pieces of pole to act as uh, spacers to hold the load in place, and that those things seem to have shifted. So that might account for why the poles are resting on the flat car. It seems like the load might have shifted in transit. If you look at it's very similar
Agree.
gondola. The gondola in the lower right has steel, vertical steel to hold the load in place, in addition to those segments of poles. Another little detail for people who model yards is note the loudspeaker system that they had in this yard. This was a little Southern Pacific yard in Phoenix, Arizona, 1988. Same load, and so you can see how they the two loads shared an idler car, and then there's a separate idler car off to the right.
Yeah, they've got two of those enunciators, I think they call them, in that picture. One
Oh yeah,
right down the
yes,
middle, or right,
yeah,
and one
yeah.
away on the left side. Yeah.
This is also in Galesburg. This almost looks like it would be aluminum rather than steel, but it's an extremely long load and it needs idler cars on both ends. And again, they elevate the load so it's not touching the idler car. Now, here are shots which don't really tell you much about idler cars, but I remember this day very clearly in the 1990s. This is on the two-line Central Canadian Pacific line that goes through Milwaukee. And I believe this was a shipment of a fractioning tower, probably being sent up maybe to the Twin Ports. But I believe it was actually a used fractioning tower. It looks like various parts of it are already rusted. But while it doesn't involve technical idler cars, you can see that tower extends beyond on both ends of its flat car. And again, it's elevated so that the flat car to the left is acting like an idler car, but it's also been utilized for part of the shipment. And the same is true of the other side of that tower. It extends beyond the length of its flat car, and the flat car that's acting as its protective idler car was also used to hold some of the load. Maybe not very heavy. Then another part of the same shipment is very close to being on its flat car, but I believe it is taking advantage of the flat cars on either end to act sort of like idler cars, but not technically idler cars. So I guess the message is if you can make some money off the car, they'd rather do that. But if they have to, they will run a totally empty idler car so that they can ship the excessive length load. And it's a lesson for us in terms of what we can model. I don't show any idler car models in this presentation, just the prototype pictures that might give you some ideas. A couple of final shots. Oops, I didn't mean to go that fast, only because this was such an interesting load. And as it rounded the curve heading north, you actually can get a little bit of an inside view of those towers. And a somewhat interesting covered hopper closer to the photographer. Nowadays, if I was taking the picture, I probably would have focused on the covered hopper. So we've looked at idler cars. Now we're going to look at a sort of an idler car, but it's more correctly called a buffer car. In recent years, we've seen more and more unit trains of tank cars hauling ethanol, gasoline, propane. In some cases where they had issues with pipelines, even petroleum was being shipped again by rail in tank cars. And here we see what's frequently done, especially with ethanol trains, and that is buffer cars. Generally, they are covered hoppers, which are of a capacity which makes them not so desirable to shippers anymore, but they're still roadworthy. they're filled with things like sand or ground up automobile tires so that in the event of an explosion, there is some sort of protection for the locomotive and crew. Actually, this particular locomotive looks like it's already had some fire issues of its own, but that's the purpose of the buffer car is in the event of definitely a worst case scenario, to provide some sort of slight protection for the locomotive and crew. If you look carefully at this picture, you'll see that the siding I was standing near isn't going to see a lot of traffic anytime soon. It's been severed. Here's another shot. This is also in Galesburg. This is in 2012 of a unit train of tank cars, but there's its buffer car. That might even be a DPU because they put buffer cars on both ends of some of these ethanol trains, and I assume the other hazmat trains. And here we see a train departing Galesburg with its buffer car, covered hopper, and the tank cars. So I would argue buffer cars are a form of idler car because they are serving a purpose that has nothing to do with them themselves having a revenue load. So this is not an idler car, but it's a car with an idler on it. So that's got to count for something. So as I wind this down, I just hope this has given you a few ideas of sort of interesting loads on your own layout where the load can exceed the length of your flat car, and then you simply make use of an idler car or two to ship that load on your layout. You'd also want to follow that idea of a very heavy load with idler cars on either end to take it easy on your bridge loadings. And if you have a car ferry or railroad barge on your layout, you probably already know all about the use of idler cars. So for the modeler, I guess just a reminder that an idler car is the devil's playground. But I don't mind the devil's playground because I model the Chicago Northwestern.
The railroad of hell.
And that's all I've got.
Little graffiti.
Yes.
Very nice, David.
So probably, so Tim is probably bristling at my railroad of hell.
I've seen others. Dave, how do they bill an idler car?
I would assume that it costs, somebody has to pay for it. I mean, for example, those Pennsylvania Railroad flat cars. I would assume that there must be some amount arrived at it, not relating to obviously the weight of the load, but I would defer to someone who actually has maybe seen the kind of wheel reports that might tell you that sort of stuff.
Okay.
I can only guess, but from a financial perspective, normally you look for a fully depreciated car. That's the only thing I from a accounting perspective, if the car, once it's fully depreciated, it doesn't have the value, and therefore it can be used for that type, maybe project type of car.
But you'd think that the owner of the car, for example, think of that Santa Fe car that was being used to ship the Union Pacific Railroad crane, or those Pennsylvania Railroad flat cars, or the TTX idler cars that we saw. I mean, it may or may not be a car that could actually hold a load and earn its own real money, but the owner would still expect payment for use of their car.
Yep.
Yeah, interesting question. I know nowadays, though, the BNSF has a fleet of idler cars and mostly made from like 50-foot air slide cars, and they're painted in the BNSF colors and all that.
So are those, I mean, for buffer cars on
Yeah,
San
they're
Carlos?
dedicated buffer cars for the rail. They're owned by the railroad. But it's a good question. Though. I don't know what they did
Right.
when in the era when they were using Penske cars and that the Penske must have made some, or Conrail or whatever, whoever owned it at that time must have been making some money on it.
Certainly, I know from the cars that were parked near where I lived in West Dallas that the Chicago Northwestern had a nice collection of very crappy Northwestern and Minneapolis and St. Louis flat cars that they could have used as idler cars, although they may not have been roadworthy. They may have had they may have still had their solid bearing trucks, or the safety appliances may have been uh, sufficiently destroyed that it would be an FRA violation to use them even as an idler car, because you'd still have to have your safety appliances. But to see those Pennsylvania railroad cars being used by the Chicago Northwestern as idler cars is kind of odd, because the Northwestern had plenty of outmoded flat cars.
Who knows?
But it's a good question. And if I give this clinic again, I better start looking into it. Otherwise, I'm going to be pinned to the wall again.
Well, sometimes these questions get answered when we post the video, so we'll see if anybody online watches
Oh,
it.
yes. The
Yes,
always reliable internet.
right. Yeah.
Not so always reliable. Dave, did you ever get up to Kewanee to photograph? You were in Milwaukee a few times. You ever get up to Kewanee? Up from Green Bay on the runs up there to load cars?
By the time it would have occurred to me to do that, the boat was no longer running to Kewanee, and I should have done it. I could have done it. We used to drive through Kewanee when I was a kid, but it was never at boat time, apparently. But the Kewanee, Green Bay, and Western served a car ferry there, and you can still see they don't really still have all the loading stuff, but you can certainly see the route that it took.
Yeah.
I did a lot of photography up there of them loading cars, etc. at Kewanee. We'd chase trains out of Green Bay. We'd make a trip to go up and watch the cars being loaded in Kewanee a few times.
Another popular place was Manitowoc.
Yep.
And of course, Manitowoc is where the Badger still docks, but it's now for cars and trucks, not railroad car ferry service.
Yeah, the Ann Arbor went to Kewanee also, I believe. Right?
I think that's right. What Chief Wawadam, was that the boat that went to Kewanee?
No, that was the Mackinac City to St. Ignace boat that hauled across the Straits of Mackinac. Yeah, I think the engines from that are in the Manitowoc Maritime Museum right now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, David. That was very interesting. Anybody else have anything to present this evening? All right. Well, we will call it a night, and everybody have a great Father's Day.
Yep, same to you.
Thank you.
We'll be
Hopefully you'll get lots of trains.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, come on. You really want socks and neckties.
That's right.
Or a bottle of booze.
Oh, that'll work.
Right. All right, gentlemen. Well, have a nice night, and we'll see you next week.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dave.
Welcome.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.